It was a quiet Thursday morning inside the Providence Municipal Court, the kind of morning where the soft hum of conversation filled the air like distant thunder before a storm. Sunlight filtered through tall, arched windows, landing gently across the wooden benches, catching flecks of dust that danced like suspended time. People whispered, shifted, and waited, but not with the usual courtroom boredom. No, today felt different. Everyone could sense it. Something rare, something historic was about to unfold. In the very front row, a 71-year-old man sat with his arm in a sling. His face carried the calm dignity of a soldier who had seen too much of life to be easily shaken. His name was James Martinez, a decorated Vietnam veteran, a man who'd once risked his life for his country and returned home quietly to build a life of decency, loyalty, and family. Today, he wasn't here as a hero. He was here as a victim. And across town, as the courthouse clock ticked toward 10 a.m., a silver Lamborghini engine roared to life. Behind the wheel sat Marcus Sterling, 29 years old, heir to one of the largest manufacturing empires on the East Coast. Born into wealth, raised in privilege, and shielded by influence, Marcus had never truly heard the word no. 5 nights ago, outside an upscale restaurant, that arrogance had turned violent. A disagreement over parking priority, something so trivial, so meaningless, had ended with a man on the ground, bleeding, humiliated, and broken. But what the audience inside that courtroom didn't know yet was that this simple assault case was about to trigger a chain reaction that would reach Wall Street, destroy a billion-dollar empire, and redefine what justice looks like when money collides with morality. Because this wasn't just any courtroom, and this wasn't just any judge. At precisely 10:03 a.m., the door to Courtroom 3 swung open, not slowly, but with a confidence that made the entire room turn. And there he was, Marcus Sterling, walking in with the posture of someone who'd already decided the outcome. Behind him trailed a wall of suits, 8 corporate lawyers, each carrying leather portfolios embossed with gold initials, Sterling Industries. Their presence shifted the energy in the room immediately. It wasn't just an entrance, it was a performance. The kind designed to remind everyone watching exactly who held the power. The gallery fell silent. A few gasped softly. Even the bailiff's expression changed, as though he suddenly realized this wasn't going to be an ordinary hearing. Judge Frank Caprio, sitting at the bench, watched them enter with the patient eyes of a man who'd seen everything. Arrogance, fear, lies, and truth, and could still tell the difference. He didn't speak right away. He simply observed. The shuffle of papers stopped. The quiet air grew heavy. When Marcus finally took his seat, his face showed no trace of worry. His tailored charcoal suit shimmered under the soft courtroom lights. His cufflinks gleamed like miniature trophies. He crossed one leg over the other, checked his designer watch, and exhaled, as if to say, "Let's get this over with." The bailiff's voice broke the silence. The state of Rhode Island versus Marcus Robert Sterling. Charge: assault and battery on an elderly person. It was a single sentence that should have carried weight, yet Marcus barely blinked. Judge Caprio glanced at the case file, then looked up, eyes steady. "Mr. Sterling," he began in a tone that was neither angry nor impressed. "Before we begin, I need to ask, how many attorneys are representing you today?" The lead lawyer stood, his voice sharp, practiced, corporate. "Your Honor, I'm Christopher Blackwell, lead counsel. With me are 7 associates and specialists from Morrison and Blackwell, New York." A faint murmur rippled through the courtroom. 8 lawyers for one assault case. Judge Caprio's brow lifted slightly. 8, yes, Your Honor," Blackwell replied. "Mr. Sterling's family believes in thorough representation." "I see," the judge said calmly. Then, after a pause, "And who's paying for all this thoroughness?" "Sterling Industries, Your Honor," came the answer, quick and confident. "Mr. Sterling's father, Robert Sterling, is the CEO. The company maintains a legal defense fund for executive family members." There it was, a sentence that, on the surface, seemed like nothing more than corporate procedure. But Judge Caprio's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Those who knew him, The clerks, the officers, even the camera crew recognized the look. It was the expression he wore when he'd just heard something deeply troubling. The judge didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded once, made a note, and continued. "Mr. Sterling," he said evenly, "how do you plead?" Marcus didn't even look up. "Not guilty." The courtroom was utterly still, except for the soft scratching of pens across notebooks. And that's when the air began to change. Because while Marcus's legal army prepared their motions and objections, confident this would be another case their money could smother, Judge Caprio had already noticed the first crack in the wall. A publicly traded company, using shareholder funds to defend the CEO's son in a personal criminal case. It wasn't just unethical, it was potentially illegal. But he said nothing yet, because good judges don't rush the moment. They let truth walk in on its own time. As the first few minutes unfolded, the crowd began to sense it too, that quiet feeling that maybe, just maybe, power wasn't going to win today. Marcus leaned back in his chair, bored. His lawyers shuffled papers. The prosecutor waited, watching the judge. Then Judge Caprio spoke again, his voice calm, but cutting through the air like a blade. "Let's begin." The screen of justice flickered to life, and the story that would shake an empire had officially begun. But here's the thing about arrogance. It blinds even the smartest men to how fragile their power really is. Because within the next hour, one phone call, just one, would expose corruption at the highest level, cost shareholders billions, and force a billionaire CEO to face the very thing he thought he was above: accountability. And as for Marcus, he was about to learn that when it comes to justice, no one, not even the son of a billionaire, stand above the law. The sound of the gavel echoed softly across the courtroom, a sound that always seemed to command both silence and truth. Judge Frank Caprio leaned forward slightly, his hands folded on the bench, as the case officially began. To his left sat James Martinez, 71 years old, dressed neatly in a pressed shirt and dark jacket. His left arm rested in a sling, his movements slow and careful. There was a quiet strength about him, the kind that didn't come from wealth or power, but from a lifetime of hard work, faith, and integrity. And to his right, seated behind a wall of lawyers, was Marcus Sterling, a man nearly half his age, but worlds apart in experience. He had never known the kind of pain that teaches humility. His life had been measured in profits, not principles. Two men, two generations, one representing sacrifice and service, the other entitlement and arrogance. That was the story about to unfold before everyone in that courtroom. Judge Caprio began with measured calm. "Mr. Sterling, you stand accused of assaulting an elderly man, a decorated veteran, in a public parking lot. How do you respond to these charges?" Marcus didn't even look at the judge. He spoke as if discussing a minor inconvenience. "Not guilty, Your Honor." It was self-defense. The audience shifted uneasily. A murmur rippled across the room. Self-defense? Against a 71-year-old man with a bad shoulder? The prosecutor, Rachel Kim, stood. Her voice was firm but respectful. "Your Honor, 5 nights ago, at approximately 9:30 p.m., the defendant, Mr. Marcus Sterling, was at the Capitol Grill in downtown Providence. Witnesses report he was visibly intoxicated and became verbally abusive toward a valet attendant. When the victim, Mr. James Martinez, tried to de-escalate the situation, the defendant shoved him violently into a parked car, resulting in a broken collarbone and severe bruising. Almost instantly, 2 attorneys stood. "Objection, Your Honor." "Sit down," Judge Caprio interrupted, his tone gentle but absolute. "You'll have your chance. Continue, Ms. Kim." Rachel nodded. "The assault was captured on security footage, Your Honor. There are multiple witnesses, and medical reports confirm the extent of Mr. Martinez's injuries." A hush fell. Everyone knew what was coming. The judge nodded toward the clerk. "Play the video." On the screen, the scene unfolded like a silent film. A sleek silver Lamborghini pulled into frame. Marcus stepped out, dressed in an expensive suit, his movements already unsteady. The valet, a young man in uniform, approached politely. The conversation started calm. Then Marcus gestured angrily, pointing, shouting. The valet raised his hands, trying to explain. And then, from the side, came James Martinez. He walked up slowly, carefully. No anger, no threat, just the calm voice of a man trying to bring peace to a foolish moment. "Sir, please calm down. It's just parking." But Marcus didn't calm down. His body turned sharply, his arms shot forward, and with both hands, he shoved James hard. The older man fell backward against a parked car, striking his shoulder, and crumpled to the ground. Gasps filled the courtroom. Even Marcus's own lawyers looked momentarily uncomfortable. When the video ended, silence lingered. Judge Caprio looked directly at Marcus. "Mr. Sterling, that appears quite clear. Do you still maintain self-defense?" Marcus smirked. "He shouldn't have touched me." "He didn't," the judge replied softly. "He tried to help you." The arrogance in Marcus's tone made something shift in the room. It wasn't just disrespect, it was detachment. The kind that comes from a life of insulation, where empathy is optional and accountability negotiable. And that's when James Martinez stood to speak. His voice was calm, but there was pain beneath it. Not just physical pain, but the quiet ache of disappointment. "Your Honor, my wife and I were celebrating our 45th wedding anniversary that night. We just finished dinner. We saw this young man shouting at the valet, calling him names no one should say to another human being. I walked over because, well, I've lived long enough to know that anger only makes fools of men." He paused, steadying his breath. I told him to calm down. He looked at me and said, "Mind your business, old man." I told him I was just trying to help. That's when he shoved me. I remember the sound more than the pain, that crack in my shoulder. I fell. My wife screamed. And he just stood there, looking down at me like I was nothing. The courtroom was utterly silent. You could feel the weight of every word, each one landing like a stone in still water. Judge Caprio's voice was soft. "Mr. Martinez, how has this injury affected your life?" "I can't work on my old car anymore," he said quietly. "Can't lift my grandson. My wife helps me dress each morning. I spent my life fixing engines, serving my country, taking care of my family. But this arm reminds me, every day, that decency can be punished by arrogance." As he spoke, Marcus yawned. A wave of disbelief swept through the room. Even the judge's composure wavered for a moment. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his tone sharpened, "did you just yawn while this man was describing his pain?" Marcus shrugged. "It's unfortunate, but accidents happen. My father will write him a check." Gasps erupted. The gallery stirred, whispers filling the air. "Write him a check?" As if decency could be bought. Judge Caprio raised his hand for silence. His eyes locked on Marcus, steady, cold, unblinking. "Mr. Sterling," he said, "what you just said might be the most revealing sentence in this entire proceeding." Across the room, James Martinez sat still, watching. Not with hatred, but with something far heavier. Pity. Because in that moment, it was clear to everyone. This wasn't just a legal conflict. It was a moral one. One man had fought for his country. The other had never fought for anything. One had built his life on principles. The other on privilege. And now, in this small courtroom, those two worlds were colliding. The 8 lawyers shuffled papers, whispering among themselves. The prosecutor stood silent, letting the moment breathe. And Judge Caprio, calm, patient, deliberate, leaned back slightly and said something no one expected. "Mr. Blackwell," he said to the lead attorney, "you mentioned earlier that Sterling Industries, a publicly traded company, is paying for this legal team. Is that correct?" Blackwell hesitated. "Yes, Your Honor. It's within the company's framework." "And Sterling Industries," the judge continued, "has shareholders, correct? People who've invested their savings, their pensions, their trust in that company." "Yes, Your Honor." Then, the judge said softly, "Those shareholders are now paying, without their consent, to defend your client for assaulting a veteran over parking space?" Blackwell's throat tightened. "It's a standard benefit, Your Honor." The judge made a note on his pad. His tone remained even, but his eyes said otherwise. Something inside him had shifted, the quiet realization that what he was seeing wasn't just arrogance. It was corruption hiding in plain sight. And just like that, the case of one arrogant son had become something much bigger. Because what Marcus didn't know, what no one in that courtroom yet realized, was that this single question would soon ignite a storm reaching far beyond Providence. A storm that would expose greed, destroy fortunes, and remind the world that even in silence, justice still listens. The courtroom was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that hums with the weight of things unsaid. Judge Frank Caprio set his pen down slowly. His face remained calm, but his eyes had narrowed, the subtle sign that a line had been crossed. He turned to the lead attorney again. Mr. Blackwell, just to be clear, Sterling Industries, a publicly traded company, is paying for the criminal defense of the CEO's son. Correct. Blackwell nodded stiffly. Yes, Your Honor. It's well within corporate policy. Judge Caprio didn't answer immediately. He simply leaned back, tapping his gavel lightly on the bench, once, twice, as if weighing the sound of justice itself. Let's proceed, he finally said. But beneath his calm tone, something had shifted. The balance of power was no longer where it used to be. The prosecutor, Rachel Kim, rose again. Your Honor, the state calls Mr. James Martinez as a witness. James stood, slow, steady, dignified. His arm trembled slightly in the sling, but his voice didn't. He recounted the story once more, the dinner, the argument, the shove, the pain. Every sentence was measured, deliberate. His words painted pictures that no amount of corporate polish could erase. But the defense wasn't done trying. The moment James sat down, one of the 8 attorneys stood. Your Honor, he said smoothly, we intend to challenge the characterization of this event. Our experts will testify that the video's camera angle distorts perception. It may appear Mr. Sterling pushed Mr. Martinez aggressively, but in fact— Sit down, Judge Caprio interrupted quietly. The attorney froze. The judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The authority in his tone carried more weight than shouting ever could. This courtroom, he said evenly, will not become a playground for theatrics. Continue, Ms. Kim. The prosecutor nodded. Your Honor, the state would now like to enter security footage and medical reports as evidence. Immediately, 2 more attorneys stood. Objection, chain of custody. Objection, authenticity of footage. Judge Caprio looked up slowly. Gentlemen, he said, I've been a judge for over 30 years. I've presided over murder cases, fraud cases, cases involving men who try to cheat entire systems. But I've never seen 8 lawyers attempt to interrupt the presentation of basic evidence in a simple assault hearing. The attorneys shifted nervously. He continued, voice calm but iron in tone. If one more of you speaks out of turn, I will hold your entire team in contempt. Understood. Silence. Good, he said, gesturing toward the clerk. Play the footage again. The video flickered onto the screen once more. But this time, Judge Caprio watched not just the image, he watched the reactions. He saw the flicker of shame on one young attorney's face. He saw the tightening jaw of the lead counsel, who already knew the footage was indefensible. And he saw Marcus, sitting back, emotionless, detached, his lips curling into the faintest smirk as though the whole thing bored him. When the video ended, the judge spoke quietly. Mr. Sterling, that video shows you shoving an elderly man without provocation. What do you have to say? Marcus leaned forward. He shouldn't have stepped in my way. That sentence, careless, entitled, cruel, hit the room like a shockwave. Even the bailiff looked up sharply. Your Honor, said Blackwell quickly, trying to control the damage. My client merely meant. I heard what he meant, Judge Caprio interrupted. And so did everyone else. The judge turned toward James. Mr. Martinez, I want to thank you for your patience today. You may sit. James nodded respectfully and returned to his seat beside his wife. She reached out and held his uninjured hand. Quiet strength between 2 people who had lived through much worse. The courtroom seemed to exhale, but the tension didn't fade. It was changing shape, from arrogance to fear, from confidence to unease. Then something unexpected happened. One of Marcus's lawyers stood again, this time with a softer tone. Your Honor, in the spirit of resolution, my client would like to offer compensation to Mr. Martinez for his injuries and suffering. Judge Caprio's eyes rose slowly. Compensation? Yes, Your Honor, the lawyer continued. Sterling Industries is prepared to offer a generous settlement to make Mr. Martinez whole. The words hung in the air. Money, the solution to every Sterling problem. Marcus leaned back, confident again, arms crossed, as if justice, like everything else in his life, was simply another thing to be purchased. But Judge Caprio didn't smile. He didn't thank them. He just stared, long enough for everyone to feel the temperature in the room drop. Mr. Blackwell, he said quietly, are you attempting to buy your client's way out of criminal accountability? Your Honor, we're simply offering a practical resolution. Practical for whom? The judge asked, voice low but carrying through the entire courtroom. For the man who did the shoving, or for the one who can't lift his arm? The gallery shifted. The silence thickened. Marcus glanced nervously at his lawyers, for the first time, unsure. Judge Caprio's next words changed everything. Mr. Blackwell, he said calmly, earlier, you confirmed that Sterling Industries, a publicly traded company, is paying for this defense. Correct. Yes, Your Honor. And those funds belong to shareholders, ordinary men and women who invested their trust in that company. Yes. The judge nodded, picked up the court phone, and said something no one expected. Clerk, get me the Securities and Exchange Commission Enforcement Division on the line. The room froze. 8 lawyers turned pale. Marcus sat upright, for the first time looking less like a billionaire's son and more like a frightened child. Blackwell stammered, Your Honor, with respect, I don't think that's necessary. I do, the judge replied calmly. You just admitted in open court that shareholder funds, public money, are being used to defend your client for assaulting a private citizen. That's a potential violation of fiduciary duty and securities law. The SEC deserves to hear this. The entire room was silent except for the faint buzz of the phone line connecting. Then a professional female voice came through the speaker. This is Director Patricia Morgan, SEC Enforcement Division. Judge Caprio spoke evenly. Director Morgan, thank you for taking my call. I'm presiding over a case involving Sterling Industries, a publicly traded company. Their legal counsel just confirmed that shareholder funds are being used for the CEO's son's criminal defense. There was a long pause on the other end. Then Director Morgan's voice came, sharp, cold, and clear. Your Honor, if that statement is accurate, it constitutes potential securities fraud and misuse of corporate assets. We will open an immediate investigation. Marcus's face drained of color. The lawyers began whispering in panic. Judge Caprio folded his hands. Thank you, Director. I'll hold this case pending your findings. Yes, Your Honor. Expect subpoenas by tomorrow morning. Click. The line went dead. And in that moment, the entire courtroom realized this was no longer about a parking lot fight. This was about justice, real, unshakable justice that didn't care about titles, suits, or family names. Marcus sat motionless. For the first time, his arrogance faltered. He looked around, surrounded by lawyers who could no longer protect him, their power evaporating with a single phone call. And as Judge Caprio calmly wrote his final note for the day, he spoke in that same measured tone, the kind that carried the full weight of decades spent defending the dignity of ordinary people. Gentlemen, he said, I hope this serves as a reminder. The courtroom is not a place for wealth to flex. It's a place for truth to stand. The gavel came down once. The sound echoed like thunder. And with it, the empire of Sterling began to crumble. The courtroom sat in stunned silence long after the SEC call ended. 8 lawyers, once confident and composed, now whispered among themselves, their eyes darting like trapped birds. The hum of panic replaced the arrogance that had filled the air only minutes earlier. Marcus Sterling, who had walked in that morning with the swagger of privilege, now sat rigid, color drained from his face. His father's empire, the same empire that had always shielded him from consequence, was suddenly trembling beneath him. Judge Frank Caprio leaned forward, voice steady as stone. Mr. Blackwell, I assume Sterling Industries will no longer be paying for your representation. The lead attorney swallowed hard. Your Honor, we'll need to consult with the company's legal department. I thought so, Caprio replied quietly. You may step back. The gavel tapped lightly, not in anger, but in finality, like the closing of a door. For a moment, no one moved. Even the air seemed to hesitate. Then, from the back of the courtroom, a journalist quietly slipped out, phone already in hand. Within minutes, the story hit local news wires. SEC investigates Sterling Industries for misuse of shareholder funds. And by the time the court adjourned for lunch, that headline had already become national. Outside the courthouse, cameras gathered like vultures drawn to history. Reporters shouted questions no one dared answer. What did the judge say? Is it true the SEC is investigating? Has Robert Sterling commented? Inside his Manhattan office, hundreds of miles away, Robert Sterling, billionaire CEO, father, and founder of Sterling Industries, was staring at a phone that wouldn't stop ringing. He'd been on a conference call with his legal board when his CFO burst into the room, pale-faced, trembling. "Sir, we've just received word. The SEC is opening a full-scale inquiry into the Corporate Defense Fund." Robert's hand froze midair. "What are you talking about?" "Sir, apparently, during Marcus's hearing, your son's attorney stated, on record, that Sterling Industries was paying for his criminal defense." The judge contacted the SEC directly. For a long moment, Robert didn't move. He just stared out the window of his high-rise office, watching the city that had once bowed to his wealth and power. Down below, traffic moved calmly, unaware that one phone call from Courtroom in Providence had just ignited a billion-dollar implosion. By the next morning, the headlines were everywhere. Sterling Industries under SEC investigation for fraud. Stock free falls after Courtroom revelation. CEO's son's assault case triggers financial meltdown. The stock opened at $147. By noon, it had dropped below $100. By closing bell, $88. A 40% crash in a single day. Billions erased. Thousands of shareholders blindsided. Retirement funds devastated. And inside the Providence courtroom, Judge Caprio sat reading the morning paper quietly before court resumed. He wasn't smiling. There was no victory in his face, only the calm sadness of a man who understood the cost of corruption. When Marcus entered the courtroom again, there was no wall of lawyers behind him, just one public defender. The navy suit was gone, replaced by something simpler. The confidence gone too. He sat quietly, eyes fixed on the floor. Judge Caprio looked at him with measured gravity. "Mr. Sterling," he said, "do you understand what's happened as a result of your actions?" Marcus didn't answer. The judge continued. "Because of your choices, a man was injured. A company was disgraced. Shareholders lost billions. Your father, once a man of power, is now under federal investigation. Do you understand that?" Marcus's voice cracked for the first time. "Yes, Your Honor." "Good," Caprio said softly, "because understanding is the beginning of accountability." At that very hour, across the country, Robert Sterling stood before a wall of reporters, eyes sunken, his once commanding voice now trembling. "I authorized the use of company fund for my son's defense," he confessed. "I believe it was within my authority. I was wrong. I've destroyed shareholder trust and violated the integrity of this company. Effective immediately, I'm resigning as CEO and selling my personal shares to reimburse the company for every dollar spent." Flashbulbs erupted like fireworks, freezing his face mid-sentence. The look of a man watching the empire he built collapse under the weight of his own pride. As his statement ended, one journalist shouted the question everyone wanted to ask. "Mr. Sterling, was it worth it? Protecting your son this way?" Robert didn't answer. He just lowered his head. Back in Providence, court reconvened. Judge Caprio adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Marcus. "Mr. Sterling, this court finds you guilty of assault and battery on an elderly person." A murmur moved through the gallery, but Caprio continued, his tone steady. "Not vengeful, but purposeful. You showed no remorse. You treated this courtroom as a stage, not a seat of justice. You mocked a veteran's pain, and your family's wealth was used to twist the meaning of accountability." He paused, the kind of pause that fills a room with moral gravity. "Your sentence is as follows: 6 months in county jail, 3 years probation, for 100 hours of community service at veteran organizations, mandatory anger management, and full restitution to Mr. Martinez for all medical and rehabilitation costs. Marcus's lips parted in disbelief. His lawyers didn't move. His mother in the gallery covered her face with shaking hands. But the judge wasn't done. Additionally, Caprio said, you are to write a formal apology to Mr. Martinez, handwritten, in your own words, and read it aloud in this courtroom. Marcus swallowed hard. I understand, Your Honor. Good, the judge said softly. Because real justice isn't about humiliation. It's about transformation. He leaned forward, his voice almost gentle now. You're not the first man to lose himself in privilege, Mr. Sterling. But you might be one of the few who learns from it. This is your chance. Take it. The gavel came down. The case of State versus Sterling was closed. But the echoes of that sound would ripple far beyond Providence. That night, television screens across America lit up with the image of Marcus Sterling being led away in handcuffs. The headlines were relentless. Judge Caprio delivers landmark ruling. No one above justice, not even a billionaire's son. And somewhere, watching quietly from his small living room, James Martinez sat beside his wife. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't vengeful. He simply nodded once, the faintest trace of relief crossing his face. Justice, real justice, had finally been served. The cell door closed with a metallic echo that lingered longer than sound should. Inside, Marcus Sterling sat on the narrow bunk, hands clasped, staring at the floor. 6 months. It had sounded short when the sentence was handed down. But in the stillness of confinement, time moves differently. Days stretch. Nights echo. Pride dissolves. Gone were the luxury suits, the designer watch, the air of invincibility. What remained was a young man stripped of the illusions that had once made him untouchable. For the first time in his life, Marcus couldn't call for help. There were no lawyers to speak for him, no father to bail him out, no company to hide behind, just silence and reflection. Each day began the same way. 5 a.m. wake-up, chores, silence. He spent his mornings cleaning hallways, sweeping floors, serving meals. And in that quiet labor, something began to change. He saw men who had nothing, men society had written off, share food with each other. He saw kindness where he once saw weakness. And slowly, the weight of what he had done began to settle on him. Not as shame alone, but as understanding. Every letter from his mother reminded him of the cost of pride. Every headline about Sterling Industries' collapse reminded him of the chain reaction his arrogance had started. Every ache in his chest reminded him that some debts can't be paid with money. And somewhere between those long, sleepless nights, a thought began to take root. Maybe this is what my father and I both needed. Not punishment, but a mirror. When his release day finally came, the world had moved on. The empire was gone. His father had resigned, selling his shares to repay shareholders. The family name, once spoken with awe, now carried the weight of scandal. But as Marcus stepped out of the prison gates, the first thing he noticed wasn't the loss. It was the light. Clean, simple, undeserved sunlight on his face. He took a breath, then another, not of freedom, but of clarity. And that's when he made his choice. A month later, Marcus walked into a small community center in Providence. The walls were lined with flags, medals, and framed photos of veterans, men and women who had served their country with quiet honor. At the front desk sat James Martinez, his arms still slightly stiff, but his spirit unbroken. He looked up and froze. Marcus removed his cap. "Mr. Martinez," he said softly, "I came to see you." James studied him for a long moment. The young man before him wasn't the arrogant heir from the courtroom. His eyes carried something different now. Humility. "I owe you more than an apology," Marcus said, voice trembling. "I owe you my respect. I assaulted you for trying to calm me down. I mocked your pain. I thought money could fix what I broke. But it can't. I destroyed my father's career, hurt people who trusted us, and all of it started because I couldn't control my temper." He paused, swallowed hard, and reached into his pocket. "This," he said, unfolding a letter, "is what the judge ordered me to write. But these words, they're mine." He began to read. Mr. Martinez, I was raised to believe power meant never having to say sorry. You taught me that power means taking responsibility. I'm not asking for forgiveness, only the chance to learn for what I've done. The room was silent. When he finished, Marcus lowered the paper and looked up. Tears stood in his eyes, not for sympathy, but for sincerity. James nodded slowly. He didn't speak right away. He simply extended his good hand. Mr. Sterling, he said quietly, I accept your apology, but I hope you'll understand something. Forgiveness isn't a gift. It's a responsibility. You've been given a second chance. Use it. Marcus gripped his hand, emotion flooding his voice. I will, sir. Over the next year, Marcus did something no one expected. He volunteered at veteran support centers across Rhode Island, cleaning halls, serving meals, listening to stories. Not for press, not for attention, but because he'd finally understood what his father's money never taught him. Humility earns more respect than wealth ever will. He spoke quietly to small groups about accountability, how pride destroys, how one careless act can ripple across lives. And little by little, the man who once thought he was untouchable began to rebuild something worth more than reputation: character. Meanwhile, Robert Sterling, now living quietly away from the boardrooms, watched his son's transformation with silent tears. He had lost everything money could buy, but for the first time in decades, he felt he'd gained something priceless: peace. He wrote a letter to Judge Caprio, not to plead, not to protest, but simply to say thank you. Your Honor, he wrote, you didn't just restore justice. You restored my son's humanity. I will live the rest of my days grateful for that. Judge Caprio read the letter in his chambers, folded it neatly, and placed it beside a stack of case files. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened, knowing justice had done what it was meant to do. Months later, Marcus returned once more to the same courtroom, not as a defendant, but as a speaker at a youth outreach event. He stood at the same spot where he had once stood in arrogance, this time in humility. He looked out at the young faces before him, students, volunteers, first-time offenders. He told them his story not as a warning, but as a lesson. Money can buy you comfort, he said, but it can't buy you character. Respect is earned. Accountability is freedom. And humility, he paused, is the only wealth that lasts. In the back of the courtroom, Judge Caprio watched quietly, hands folded, eyes steady, the same calm presence he'd always been. When Marcus finished, the judge stood. Mr. Sterling, he said gently, you finally understood the law that matters most. Not the law written in books, but the one written in the heart. Marcus bowed his head. Thank you, Your Honor. The judge nodded once. Case closed, permanently. As the audience applauded softly, the camera would fade on Marcus shaking hands with James Martinez. Two men who had started as enemies, now bound by something deeper: respect. The veteran who had lived through war. The son who had lived through arrogance. Both redeemed, in different ways, by the quiet, relentless power of justice. The courtroom lights dimmed, and yet the memory of what had transpired there seemed to linger far beyond the walls. Justice, after all, is not just a verdict. It is a mirror, reflecting pride, humility, and the weight of every choice we make. For Marcus Sterling, the journey had begun with arrogance and entitlement. He had believed money could shield him from consequence, and privilege could erase responsibility. But the quiet firmness of Judge Caprio, the dignity of James Martinez, and the inexorable truth of accountability had reshaped his understanding of life. He walked out of that courtroom no longer as a billionaire's son, but as a man who had faced the full measure of his mistakes and learned from them. James Martinez, the veteran whose shoulders still bore the echoes of that night, sat quietly with his wife, watching the world move on. Yet, he felt a calm satisfaction that transcended the legal victory. It was a knowledge that decency, courage, and moral fortitude had prevailed over entitlement and power. In the weeks that followed, the story became more than a headline. It became a lesson, whispered in classrooms, discussed in offices, and shared in living rooms across the nation. People spoke not of the stock market crash, nor of the billionaire's fall. They spoke of honesty, loyalty, accountability, and respect. The greatest lesson, perhaps, came quietly in the acts that couldn't be televised. Marcus volunteering at veteran centers, listening to the stories of men and women who had lived through far greater struggles, humbled him in ways money never could. Robert Sterling, who had once believed wealth was a shield, found humility in the ruins of an empire and realized that character is the most enduring legacy a father can leave to a son. Judge Caprio returned to his chambers after the final session, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He had seen countless trials, but few had left him with the profound satisfaction of witnessing genuine transformation. A young man humbled, a father learning accountability, and a victim finding justice beyond the courtroom walls. And that, he thought, is why the law matters. Not for punishment alone, not for headlines, but for restoring the balance between power and morality, wealth and humanity, arrogance and conscience. The courtroom had been silent for 6 months, yet the echoes of this case would resonate far longer. It was not a story of revenge or spectacle. It was a story of humanity restored. Marcus Sterling would never forget the day his life changed. James Martinez would never forget the quiet courage that had allowed him to endure. And every person who followed the story would carry a simple, profound truth. No one is above justice. No one is beyond accountability. True strength lies not in wealth, but in integrity, humility, and the courage to do what is right. The gavel had fallen. The empire had shaken. Lives had changed. And in the calm after the storm, the world understood a lesson that money could never buy, that character endures and justice, when patiently served, never fails.